All right, well, here we are. Aloha, kako, and good evening. My name is Dr. Britton Brooks, and I am a lecturer in medieval British literature here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm also the founder and director of Converging Epistemologies. I'm afraid our co-founder and co-director has had to leave due to some unfortunate circumstances, so she can't be here, but her name is Jade Higa, and she is extremely important in the putting together of this event. As this is our inaugural event, I still have some feedback, right? There's no mic by me. How weird. All right, well, if I hug the wall, what do you think? Okay. As this is our inaugural event, I would like to begin by telling you a bit about what we actually do and what the point of converging epistemologies actually is. So an epistemology, loosely defined, is a way of knowing, including knowing a concept, knowing how something is done. While this is a rich field of philosophical inquiry, we take the term here at its broadest meaning. For example, let's begin with what appears a simple question. Is it going to work? No?
Almost.
Almost? Or not? Maybe someone can just tap my computer.
Well, would you mind just...
Sorry, just tap the right arrow. There we go. Okay, and tap it one more time, please. Sorry. Excellent, thank you. So, my question to you today is, what is a mountain? It seems like an obvious question, doesn't it? Is it a gathering of stone distinct from the gathering next to it in height, shape, and constituent geology? Is it a place to test oneself? A place to climb, hike, summit? We talk about this, don't we? We summit these things, we feel good about that for some reason. Do we know it by our feet? Its sharpness, softness, its heat, its cold? Even as we look in awe upon it and take pictures? Is it a foundation upon which we build our homes and schools? Is it a resource for our buildings and artifice? I grew up in Aiea Heights on the slopes of the Ko'olau, so to me, whenever I go up a mountain, I kind of feel like I'm going home. Is it an ecosystem with its own inhabitants, birds, pigs, mosquitoes? What about our mountain? Does anyone recognize this particular mountain in the photo? Look familiar to anybody? It's a bit taller than Diamond Head, perhaps. Very good. This is a picture, it's hard to see, but in the far right corner are the observatories. This picture is of Mauna Kea, a place sacred to many. It is a place of identity. Its story is of a convergence of geology, mythology, culture, language, and history. It is also at the forefront of our exploration of the universe. Perhaps it's all of these. Mountains are places rich in converging ways of knowing. Magma, granite, limestone, converging with Pele, Kami, our ancestors, all mixed up with our lived experience. We know them for their height, use them as metaphors for strength and stability. Our very bones formed from the minerals that flow down their sides. The world, this example suggests, is complex, layered, interdependent. We ourselves are entwined biological systems with a mind, a will, shaped by culture, language, education, location, and experience. Converging epistemologies recognizes this complexity and seeks to address the issues of our contemporary world by bringing together our different ways of knowing. We are scholars in front of you today. We approach questions in a variety of ways with a variety of tools in our individual disciplines. Yet there are also ways of knowing beyond that of the university. And when brought together, all these perspectives can generate new answers to the difficulties we all face. Together, with respect and a little bit of hope, we can know the world just a little bit better. So our inaugural event, we have taken the topic of life in the Anthropocene. And we have an amazing panel here to discuss this with you today, and I would like each of our panelists to introduce themselves before we jump into the discussion proper. I'm going to sort of go down the line if you like.
Okay, I'm Kieka Madison. I'm an associate professor in the history department. I teach environmental history, and my work is on France, early modern and revolutionary France. Okay.
I'm Justin Wagoner. I'm an assistant professor in biology. I've done research including animal behavior, ecology, how animals interact with their environment, particularly through their sensory capabilities.
I'm Jamie Hamilton-Ferris, and I teach in the art and art history department. I mostly teach critical theory from the perspective of materialist feminism. And I'm writing a book right now called Liquid Archives on the Ocean as a system that counters the capitalist trade system.
My name is John Reeder. I'm a professor of English. I teach courses in critical theory and science fiction is my special field these days.
Excellent, thank you very much. All right, so we're going to start with a series of questions, and the panelists will each get to respond to it in their own way. But given that we have an interesting term to start with, the Anthropocene, we're going to start with definitions, because we're academics and we always start with definitions, don't we? So if we could start with that, and could we get some slide motion as well, please? Sorry.
Thanks.
Another one, please. And another one. There we go. Thank you very much.
Could I just ask real quick, is the feedback okay, or is it too much?
It's a bit much.
Is it? It's okay? Okay.
We're even further away from it. Good try.
I would prefer that.
Okay. How about now? Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
No lights.
No mics.
Okay.
I don't know.
I mean, as long as maybe we just turn it down. Like if that's, I don't know if that's
Sadly, I don't
possible.
have the key.
Let's just go with it for now.
Go with the mics?
Yeah, I mean, there's some people who are hearing it here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So our first question is defining the term the Anthropocene. What exactly it means. Still going, isn't it? Yeah. Move them down, maybe. Sorry. So again, we're going to start with definitions. If Keiko, if you'd like to take us into this.
Oh, sure. So I was talking to the group earlier, and I was saying how a number of my colleagues and my neighbors said, "Oh, we see that you're going to be on this panel. What is that?" And I thought they were talking about panelists, you know, what's the format of the panel, and it dawned on me slowly that actually what they were asking me was, what's the Anthropocene? And I should have not assumed that everybody knows what that is. Certainly I don't assume that of my students. So could you hit the next slide and we'll take a look. I have a few slides that I often use for my students that I'll just run by you really quickly. One thing about the Anthropocene is that there's no set agreement on how it's pronounced. Spell check doesn't like it. I say Anthropocene or I say Anthropocene, tomato, tomato. But the word was coined by Paul Crutzen, who was a Dutch chemist. And in 2000, he and one of his colleagues, another academic, who I must say, I've forgotten his name, proposed a new epoch, a new geological epoch, and to call it the Anthropocene. Could you go to the next slide, please? Now, if you look, we are in the Holocene, which is an era. I'm not a geologist, so correct me if I'm wrong, but within eras are epochs, and the epoch that we are currently, that is proposed that we are in, is the Anthropocene. And what then is the Anthropocene? Well, according to Crutzen and those who are going along with this definition, could you hit the next slide? It's the moment at which human impact upon the world is so great that we are changing every single aspect of the planet in ways that are profound and lasting. Some of the ways we can look at this are, for example, since 1700, the amount of land used for agriculture has increased fivefold. Between 1970 and 1997, the global consumption of energy has increased by 84%. Since 1945, the global population has almost tripled. So in many people's lifetimes in this room. Grain production has tripled since 1945. Energy consumption has quadrupled. Economic activity has quintupled. 3/4 of the carbon that humans have contributed to the Earth's atmosphere has accumulated during the post-1945 period. In the last 150 years, humans have exhausted 40% of known oil reserves that took millions, hundreds of millions of years to generate. Nearly 50% of the land surface has been of the Earth has been changed by human action. And more than half of all accessible fresh water has been appropriated for human use. So on and on and on with these statistics, right? The impact, of course, is that we are in a new age, and that's not even beginning to address the atmosphere. Within the Anthropocene, there's an argument to be made that there's what's called a great acceleration that starts in the post-1945 period. This is the moment at which those changes really take off. Could you go to the next slide? And so right now, the International Union of Geological Scientists is trying to determine whether they're really going to accept this term, the Anthropocene, as a new epoch within the Holocene era. And they've been working on this study since 2014. And they're going to vote on it later this year in 2018. But they want to find what they call the golden spike. And the golden spike is the moment at which they can pinpoint that the global impact of human activities is measurable. And just a couple of days ago, all over the news, in The Economist, and Forbes, you know, pretty mainstream outlets, an article came out about the world's loneliest tree in the Southern Ocean on Campbell Island. Shows evidence of the radioactive isotopes associated with atomic testing. And they pinpointed that date when that tree, which is the only tree on the only island in this place in the Southern Ocean, is in 1965. So they say, aha! Now, other scientists have other measures. But for geologists, the Anthropocene is something measurable and quantifiable and can fit within these stratigraphic schemas. That's about it, I would say.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Could you go back to the original slide with just the questions on it about the definitions, about 3 slides back? Or one more. There we go.
So,
Yes.
can I-
Yes, jump in, Jamie. Of course, yeah.
So one of the ways to kind of approach this question of the term Anthropocene is to look at it in this larger debate about climate change and kind of think about what the strategic uses of the Anthropocene versus climate change or other words that have been proposed to. And so one of the critiques of the Anthropocene is kind of thinking about where the name comes from and how it's designated generally as all of these changes have happened because of humans at large. And one of the conversations around the Anthropocene is that it's not humans in general, but certain humans and certain kinds of systems that have caused the great spike and the great acceleration. So other terms that have been proposed, and one of my favorites is the capital C. Which kind of by Jason Moore in 2014, and he's talking about the way in which trade, extraction, and human exploitation and asymmetrical power relationships have really changed the world imaginary in which everything is valued as an economic resource, and that imaginary has kind of created this shift. So the capital scene is kind of a term that's often paired with the Anthropocene, so it might be useful to think about that term as well. And then the Thulacene is another great term that's been proposed by Donna Haraway as a kind of metaphor for thinking about a more positive positive relationships within this epoch. For thinking about multi-species relationships that will take us into the future, thinking about interdependence and kinship and ways of approaching the era in which we are in a more positive way with a future-looking kind of lens rather than with, and I think we'll get to this, rather than the kind of maybe feudalistic or melancholic kind of tones that the Anthropocene often engenders. So I just wanted to throw those out there too, because I think it's important to note that the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, the Thulocene, whatever term you're thinking about, these are concepts, and they're humanities concepts, and they're concepts that we need to think about, you know, whether they're useful or not and how useful they are. And I go back to this quote that Timothy Morton wrote in Ecological Thought. He says, one of the things that modern society has damaged, along with ecosystems and species in the global climate, is thinking. The Anthropocene serves here as a designation for human obligation towards the geo and the biosphere, and is really about overcoming the fact that we're not thinking in wider frameworks and, you know, more imaginative ways about the world in which we live. So it's kind of a way to start out, like, what does this concept do for us? So maybe one of you.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. Show of hands, how many people prior to attending this, prior to maybe seeing a flyer for this event, had ever heard of the term Anthropocene? So some, but not all of you. I think it's a really interesting term because it's not fully owned by any of the disciplines from which we come. As was introduced, it sprang from geology, but it's only being posed as an official designation in that field. So it's not even fully owned by the geologists. Let me come back to the idea, but I do want to make a point. Within geology, and then ultimately if this does become official and is accepted, you know, globally when we talk about the sciences, within geology there is a lot of evidence for this as an official designation, as a geologic epoch. So in geology, what we're talking about here is global changes, indelible changes, changes that have occurred on this planet and are evident 100,000 years later, a million years later, hundreds of millions years later. So that's what we're talking about here, not just are currently human beings making an impact on this planet. That's obviously clear. We can see that human beings are present on this planet, no matter where we go. But the idea here is that the change has been so severe that evidence of humanity's existence will be present in the stratigraphy, the layering of the Earth. Again, thousands or millions of years out from here. And one statistic that really struck me is that we've put together enough concrete, and concrete is a human construction, it's a human invention, that we've had since the time of the ancient Romans. There's enough concrete now put together and present on the surface of the Earth that even if all this was pulverized into a fine dust and spread out evenly over the entire surface of the Earth, we'd still have a kilogram per meter square. So that's, you know, you can imagine any kind of apocalypse that wipes us off the face of the Earth, and that residue is still left, and again, part of the geology of this planet. So that's the magnitude of effect we're talking about here. Coming back to my original point, however, this is a term that I had heard previously, but I hadn't thought about until recently. It's shown up a lot more recently in the last year, maybe 2 years, in the popular press. So it's an idea that is kind of converging, materializing through various contributions from various sciences or academic disciplines, but just also in the popular consciousness. Collectively, it seems that we're reassessing our impact not just on each other, but on the planet again in this kind of permanent way. So I think that's fairly significant. That's a different idea than some of the other ones that we deal with on a regular basis.
Yeah, so let me pick up in here. So yeah, the stratigraphy of the Earth, the surface of the Earth is permanently changed with the invention of the steam engine in the 1780s. From that date forward, there's a layer of carbon emissions in the atmosphere that leaves its trace on the Earth, and yeah, it will be there. It's permanent. It's going to be there. With the explosion of the first atomic bomb in 1945, we start to have radioactive fallout that is a pretty permanent part of it. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,100 years. So, you know, that fallout's going to be there a really long time, right? Those radioactive dust particles that got into the atmosphere when they set off the first bomb in Los Alamos are still there. And they will be there for another 20,000 years, at least, floating around the Earth. And that's not counting all the other bombs that were exploded right up until the North Koreans this year. So the notion of the Anthropocene is based on that permanent geological record. But I think in my neck of the woods, the term Anthropocene has more to do with, well, it has to do with two things. One of them is notions of scale, and the other is what I would call the ongoing deconstruction of man and reason. The Anthropocene is a notion that I think is linked to thinking about the impact of human activity on the planet or within the planetary context, that instead of seeing human reason as like a godlike fashioning of the environment, sees it more as something like the collision in a comet that wiped out the dinosaurs. It's a great extinction event. And we are in the midst of a long, long event that is seeing a massive decrease in biodiversity in the world. And the Anthropocene is a name for that as well. They're not quite synonymous with one another. But the notion of scale, I think, is quite important here. These are things that you can't see. These are things that you can't grasp by looking at them. There's climate change or global warming is something that is ungraspable in a certain way in terms of personal responsibility. There's no way. You can say every time you turn the key of your ignition on your car, you contribute to global warming. Every time you turn on a light bulb, you contribute to global warming. But that's an impossible kind of ethical quandary to put yourself in, because you can't not turn the ignition. And you can't actually statistically say, oh, my not turning on the car is going to make any difference. It's so infinitesimal contribution that your personal liability is immeasurable. So the Anthropocene is a concept that gives, body to this impossibility of scale, where, you're in the midst of an event that so far transcends the level of personal responsibility that you need another way of thinking to grasp it.
Also, you have other ethics.
Yeah.
Which maybe we can get to a little bit later on.
Yeah, I think one of our last questions is scale. If we go to the next question, and it's many slides later, I think.
Keep going.
Keep going.
That's one
Keep
minute.
going. Right, so here's the scale question, and this is actually a very important one, right? I mean, part of the point Timothy Morton makes very eloquently that you're referring to, I think, John, with the key turning in the car, is this impossibility of reaction, right? I mean, it's great. I like to turn off lights whenever I go around and turn them off. I feel like I'm doing something great in the universe. And sure, maybe in aggregate, if you add up all the bees in the world doing the same thing, there is some discernible potential help. But it's the scale that is somewhat defeating, both conceptually and also with an action. I mean, I do wonder how within each of our disciplines, we can respond to the idea of scale. I mean, in the humanities, for instance, I'm a medievalist, just to say. I like things that are super old in terms of, human culture. They are fairly old. But even they, of course, are extraordinarily young in geologic time. I mean, deep time is such a difficult concept. I have physics friends who give me these numbers of things that happened 13.8 billion years ago. It's literally, to me, an ungraspable concept. There's lots of zeros. I know it's a long time ago. It seems very impressive, right? But as a graspable concept, as something that you can sink your teeth into. I think the Anthropocene is unsettling in its ability to make us question our individual roles, the roles of our various disciplines, our own work. I mean, we're all very wedded to our work. We spend lots of time doing it, lots of hours in it. And I suppose my question to all of you as we move into the ideas of scale is, how do you think, is there a way to approach that isn't disabling, that doesn't leave us sort of adrift? Because I think one reaction to inconceivable scale is simply saying, I'm out. Stepping back, like, you know what? I can't. Turning on my key has no relevance. Should I just drive down the street? Why do anything else? So I suppose my question for the panel is, how do you respond when these scales are so unimaginable? Do you retreat? Do you respond? What exactly do you do, both personally but also within your disciplines?
I'd like to answer that a little bit by saying that there is a way in which that term and the scale is incredibly disempowering. And that is the political liability, which I don't know if I want to get to now, but I mean, certainly in my field as an environmental historian, in the environmental activist community, there's a great deal of skepticism about not just the term, but the enthusiasm with which it has been embraced. Because, I mean, to go back to scales, the Earth is about, what, 4.5 billion? 4.5 billion years old. Humans have been around 200,000 years or so. Not a biologist here. He is.
We all look at the scientists.
But here we have something that's essentially dated to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but really the Great Acceleration to post-1945. But if it's all of our fault, then is it any of our problems? And certainly those who see themselves as addressing it on the scale that it affects us, some of those people are not those with the most just of intentions, but those who would propose really global scale solutions, seeding the ocean, putting massive reflectors into the sky, and Elon Musk blowing his Tesla out into the outer stratosphere. Big men with big egos and big ideas. Those are the kinds of people who quite like the idea of the Anthropocene because, hey, all bets are off. There are no more natural systems, so let's go for it.
So Leah, okay, so I'll jump in there. Okay, so much to say. Just first of all, let me put this in your little thought in your head. Bruno Latour has this really amazing essay called "Waiting for Gaia," and he talks about it. I mean, he's got a very massive, complex theory, but the basic idea is that we got to this position through all of these incremental, accumulative effects of turning on lights, starting cars, building factories, et cetera, So why cannot those same accumulative effects of transformation not have the same transformative power? So I think that's a very important construct to think about, an imaginary, a concept that I think is true even if individual humans don't necessarily have the capacity of perception to see those changes happen in their lifetime, in their children's lifetime, or even their children's lifetime. And so it kind of puts onto the table the idea that we have to start thinking beyond human perception. And I think this goes back to your larger kind of deconstruction of man and reason, right? It's and from where I sit in feminist critical theory, this is really exciting, because all of a sudden we can think about different ways of perceiving connection and relationships and scale. That it's not, that we don't have to always think in terms of an individual human lifetime. We can start imagining different kinds of relationships to time and the earth. And so I do those things because even if I don't see them, they will have an effect on the earth. And I care about the earth as a material, as an agent, as something, and the earth and all of the beings in it, the other humans, et cetera, and it comes back to this ethical question that we can get into a little bit later. But I like flipping the question of time and scale to yes, these are big numbers, but Carl Sagan has that cosmic calendar that he shares in the cosmos, where everything is put into the calendar year. And in the geologic time scale, people play with this quite often, where the first living single cell organisms kind of come to being in February 25th, and humans come into the calendar in the last 82 seconds before midnight of New Year. And I often wonder if all of this is, if we're talking about, and I really want to emphasize the importance of the Anthropocene as a concept too, because I think carbon emissions and all of these things are really what has caused the kind of turning points that we're seeing now. And all of that is just a few seconds in the geologic record. And if it's just a few seconds, then why cannot another few seconds transform that geologic record into something else? So I'm a big believer in thinking about future possibilities too.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that with the time scale issue and the order of magnitude issue. Like I mentioned, I've done some research in sensory biology, sensory ecology, looking at how animals acquire information from their environment via whatever sensory tools they have. So I've done work with insect vision, how insects see. I've done a little bit of work in animal behavior with mammals. And an important recognition, and this is just foundational animal behavior, foundational sensory ecology, is that each of these animals has a very different perspective on the world. There's certain aspects of the world that we find very important, things that are very conspicuous to us, that are literally invisible to other animals. I mean, to make the point as clearly as possible, certain animals have eyes and certain animals do not, but on any finer scale, the same holds. So our eyes pick up certain wavelengths of light, other animals' eyes pick up different wavelengths of light. And there's also a time aspect to that. Certain animals, their vision is more sensitive to very quick actions, very slow actions are invisible to them, and vice versa. My point there being is that we have specific sensory tools, and then also very specific cognitive tools that have also been shaped by evolution. Evolution being a universal process, if this individual has a certain set of tools produced by their genome, their genes, then they have access to certain information. If that information is useful to them, gives them an advantage in reproducing, if they end up having more offspring, then in the next generation you have more models, so to speak, that have that particular set of tools. Our set of tools produced by evolution gives us the ability to respond to things on the minute scale, the second scale. We have memory, so we can perceive things, plan for things, react to things over days and maybe years, but the evolutionary tools we've acquired do not give us the ability to even comprehend timescales beyond that. Because up until this point in time, having an ability to do so did not confer any advantage whatsoever in the day-to-day competition, right? You can play this kind of thought game if an individual in a previous generation, in a previous century, had the ability to think centuries ahead, does that give them the ability to have more offspring than somebody else? It did not. So we're at a lack when we're switching these timescales now, and there are things that are happening on a global scale, now on the order of decades, that actually can affect our survival as a species. So we have predictions, well-supported, very conservative predictions concerning temperature increases across the globe, sea level increases across the globe, and some of these are fairly catastrophic predictions in less than the next 100 years. So now this, what typically would have been taking place over millennia, is taking place possibly within a single generation. So we have to kind of flip both ways. We have to have this long-term scale for which we don't have the evolutionary cognitive tools to deal with. We have to kind of superimpose that on what we are dealing with and kind of bring those two things together. What am I personally doing? What affects my personal life? And then what am I doing that ties into the global set of necessary regulations at this point. And it is very confusing, and there's a biological reason for that confusion.
Thank you. I think for me, a way to try to grasp the issue of responsibility as it is shifted and as notions of human agency are decentered, I think, by a notion like the Anthropocene, is to remind myself that life does not reside inside an organism. You tend to think of a body as being alive, a person as being alive, but the fact is that life is actually a transaction between an organism and what's outside the organism. Organisms do not live by themselves. Organisms always are part of some kind of transaction, and that transaction is always ongoing. One kind of transaction is called life, and another kind of transaction is called death and decay. And the sense of the individual autonomy that comes with being an organism of the human type is usefully undercut by reminding yourself that your body is only alive in terms of its interaction with everything else.
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to jump back in here again. I'm actually at the moment teaching a course on the origin of life, and one of the issues we immediately had to deal with was how do we define life? What do we consider to be a living entity? And that idea of systems embedded in larger systems actually becomes a big problem in defining life because, as John said, none of us, we would all consider each of ourselves as being alive and being autonomous. This is me and this is the environment. But we obviously breathe in oxygen, we breathe out CO2, we require temperature flux, we require obviously food as fuel. So we don't exist independent of some larger system. And it might seem like kind of a petty thought exercise or a game or just a means for bringing up an argument. But really within scientific circles, this is something that is actually a worthy academic pursuit and also influential on how we act in these regards here. Defining life is a matter of scale, and then as we go beyond our planet, increasingly looking for life elsewhere in our solar system or beyond our solar system, these basic definitions matter. So even with things like life, time, existence, this is not a debate that takes place just in literature or in philosophy. These are debates that take place in biology and in the sciences as well.
Yeah, and I think to tie it back to the tour notion of Mackay, that's the idea is that it's a big mistake to think that you are separate. It's a big mistake to think that you have command or you have control over the environment. There are things you can do, but of course, but to, I mean, the fantasy of being able to establish an extraterrestrial environment where you could live is very difficult to sustain when you think about it really hard, because in order for a spaceship to actually make it in for a long time, it has to be a self-sustaining ecosystem of its own, which in effect means it has to be a planet. You know, it could be, and how small can a planet be? Then becomes the question. So, you know, Elon Musk can blast his Tesla into outer space and, you know, set up a little tent on Mars maybe, at an enormous cost, and it's totally parasitical on planetary resources from Earth. There's nothing about it that's not simply sapping energy and resources in that direction. But you know, Elon Musk is immaterial. Let's talk about the coal industry. Let's talk about the oil industry. Let's talk about how we, you know, how we sustain our lives, and then the conversation starts to become more concrete, and more concrete and more difficult. Right. So, you know, the notion of the Cthulhu that Donna Haraway invented is very much, I think, about this notion of thinking of yourself as enmeshed in a complex web of relationships, thinking of relationship as the fundamental unit of analysis. There are no atoms, there are only relationships between things that make it appear that there are atoms. That kind of thinking, okay, that there's never just one thing to think about, there's always two things at least in relationship to one another. And once you start applying that kind of thinking rigorously or, you know, stubbornly to political and social questions, maybe that's where the opening to survivable, and not into sustainable, because what's sustainable capitalism is not a good idea. But survivable, a survivable planet, a survivable future might appear.
Do we want to talk about the second?
Oh,
Should we jump on the question of-
How does it show that
The value.
Yeah, so I mean, part of the connection that we're trying to draw here between all that we're saying is, so then is of course the actual sort of actions, right? And one connection to this is value. What happens when we're confronted with these variety of approaches? Does it change what we think is important? Because of course what we care for, what we think is important, changes how we behave. I mean, this distinction, right, between systems and life, between non-living and what we define as actually alive, is important. I mean, I played an ethical game with some of my students, so I think I've known the rest of you guys yet, but I will soon enough. It's a game where it's very blunt. I ask, you know, if you had a choice, you had to kill something, would you kill a horse or a mosquito? Who would kill the horse? Anybody? Right, nobody, because we decided that is to some degree more important. And to take it a bit further, would you kill a dog or would you cut down a tree? We create hierarchies and orders based on, very often, sentience, right? The level at which we think something is aware. But that is an ascription of value. We decided that a dog, by virtue of its sentience, by virtue of its specific type of feeling that is considerably closer to our own, is somehow more valuable than a tree, which even though research has recently shown, right, that trees essentially scream when they get cut, right? They literally spray some chemicals out to their neighbors saying, this is bad, something bad's happening, by the way, this is terrible, right? So, but from our perspective, right, the thing that looks more like us, more mammalian, we say, well, you know, it probably feels better, so if I had to choose, I would take down the tree, right? But, so this all gets to the question of value connects directly to how we act, to what we choose to do, what we choose not to do. And so do these questions that we're dealing with, do these perspectives that we're engaging with, do anything to how we ascribe value to anything? I suppose is where we're going.
Well, I love your example because it's the perfect way to construct the question of like, that question about should I kill this or this is basically an ethical frame in which the value is from a human framework.
Right.
Where what we need is to think, well, why do we have to choose between those two? You know, and who says that's the ethical question on the table? And so thinking, turning toward, there's a great small book called Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene. And it's a way of thinking about the ethics of life in general, like not just morality or legal questions, but going back to this question of what is life, and then how do we value life, and if we're thinking about life in terms of larger networks and even agencies, then we have to rescale our value systems. So, I mean, I think it's important to just kind of understand, first of all, the frame of the ethical question that you're asking.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about that Carl Sagan calendar. I do think that the 82 seconds to midnight is, it's in some ways great, because we've only got, not very good at math, but not too many more seconds to go, and then we're out, and on to the next. I mean, the planet, in a way, the hubris of the Anthropocene as a term, because it is hubristic, assumes that the anthro, the human component, is the significant factor here, but the planet will keep on going. Yes, we have concrete all over and plastic embedded and so on, but does it really matter? I mean, at that scale, it's hard for me to determine value, but then I really quite like the idea of life existing in the spaces in between, in the relationships, in which case the value ought to be on those very fragmentary, fleeting moments that we as humans have with each other, and make those the most meaningful and rewarding moments that we could possibly have. So it really reduces it from the grand scale to the most momentary.
Let me jump in here and offer a different interpretation of value, not in any universal sense, but just value to us as a species. Because this is a discussion that takes place very commonly now in ecology, and from ecology this is spread out to certain aspects of general society, including industry, business. We can actually put a monetary value, or attempt to put a monetary value, on different living organisms, different ecosystems. This is one approach now to increasing involvement in conservation, to recognize what are referred to as ecosystem services, things that intact ecosystems provide to us that we would have to pay for and build machines or build systems to take care of if we were to lose those ecosystem services. So temperature moderation, being close to an intact ecosystem, even being close to trees here, reduces air conditioning costs. Water purification, if you have bare ground, then you get no water purification, no removal of toxins, no removal of sediment from water as it goes back into the aquifers or back into the systems. And these ecosystem services, once we start looking at them, and there have been several big projects that have done this, actually end up totaling up in not just the millions, but potentially billions of dollars. So there's different ways to come at this. You can come at this as a universal estimation of value, or a more utilitarian, directed towards us, actual monetization of the value. So again, this is not an abstract argument here. All of these lines of thought actually can be applied differently, but potentially equally in all of these fields. So yeah, it's not necessarily just morality, but money in some cases. We have to say, how valuable is this? How valuable is this? How valuable is this? And how valuable is this? Another perspective I can offer from biology is if a researcher here at any other university wants to conduct research on vertebrate animals, so that's mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, amphibians, they have to acquire certification approval from the university or the institution's Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, in which you present a project plan, a justification, and explain why it is you need to be working on animals, specifically what you're going to do, how much damage that's going to cause the animal, and the research cannot proceed, it cannot ultimately be published, the same cannot be accepted by the scientific community until it gets that approval. And part of that approval process involves, of course, telling what kind of animal you're going to use, and there actually is a listed written hierarchy of animals. You know, fish are more easy to get approval to work on than are amphibians, than are reptiles. Once you're in mammals, mice are easiest to get approval on, rabbits, goats, pigs, and then primates at the top being most difficult. So again, and I want to emphasize this because it's important with actually applying what we talk about here to the real world. These are not abstract arguments. These already come into play on a daily basis in biology and the other sciences.
I don't know one more I can add about value. I mean, you know, value is fundamentally linguistic. You know, words are values. It's one way that when Saussure talks about words, structural linguist Ferdinand Saussure, he actually calls them values because there's a system of differences by which they acquire meaning. They're not meaningful in themselves, only in relationship to other sounds from which they differ. And he uses the term value to talk about that difference. So value always has to do with measuring differences. There always has to be a reason for measuring those differences or articulating those differences. So what do I draw from that? I draw from that well, value is human. There's nothing, there's no way to construct a system of values that's not fundamentally anthropocentric. And so it makes a certain kind of sense that we would rather chop down a tree than kill a horse, since a horse is more like a human being than a tree is. That's kind of shifting around there. But, the monetization of value is a different issue, and it's the most typical systemic feature of capitalism. Capitalism only becomes possible on the basis of sufficient volume of commodity exchange that you have a universal equivalent that appears, that's called money. Right? Something that you can translate all the other values into. You can translate a bushel of wheat and a drink of water and a piece of wood and a coat and everything else all into the same set of terms. So this use of that to measure actual environmental cost is something I would certainly cheer for and say is a great idea because it puts the cost of environmental damage or environmental exploitation or environmental appropriation of resources, environmental use, in terms of the most basic kind of value for our society, which is the universal equivalence between commodities, what it actually costs to make something and to sell and buy it.
Well, except for the fact that the problem with ecosystem services argument and the problem with monetizing nature is who then assesses value. And it actually, perhaps from conservationist biologist's point of view, the ecosystem services analysis has had positive effect. I think you'll have to tell me. But it's my sense from those who are most robustly in favor of preserving ineffable qualities like wilderness, that, which is itself a kind of human concept for sure, that monetizing everything does not protect things. It simply puts things back more firmly into the capitalocene. And its pernicious effect has been to create those same hierarchies you're talking about with lab animals, to create those with entire societies. So, I mean, we're seeing choices, monetized choices about who, I mean, even within humans, we choose to protect. Much less, you know, a Sitka spruce versus a redwood, or, you know. So I've always found this ecosystem services argument to be quite problematic and not at all the answer. I don't know what is the answer, but I rebel against it.
No, I think that's an important perspective, because for the ecosystem service idea to work, it does have to be appealing to people, and not just a few people, but it has to be a general idea to which societies invest. Situations where it has seemed to have some positive effect is when it's done at kind of a national level. So it's a means by which a nation, maybe a less well-developed nation, can kind of push, actually it's a way in which these less developed nations that have less capital as it's normally recognized can actually push back against international capitalistic interests by showing, most importantly to each other, that this tree, this intact forest, does have some value that we can quantify, however you want to quantify it. And we're used to quantifying value in terms of dollars, so that's the most easily accessible way to think about this, and the most easily accessible way that can be communicated to everyone. So it's inherently basically just a quantification, and a quantification is a recognition that these things have value. You can convert that quantification into any unit that you like. Money just is the most convenient, most universal term. And then you can leverage that and trade and barter, not just with other national entities or corporations, but amongst yourselves and also between the present and the future. So yeah, it's an idea, as you point out, that has to be bought into. If we don't have that, then the approach itself decreases in value.
I think this is a really interesting vein, but we are running a little short on time. So let's move on to maybe the next question and see what it is and if it's relevant to Eric. You want to do this one, or should we move on to another one? Another one. Moving on, next. Human animal divide useful?
I like this one.
You like this one? Okay. So this question goes back to people like Timothy Morton, for example, right, who question this as part of the pernicious reason why we are in the Anthropocene, if we take this as an acceptable sort of designation, or at least in a place in which things like climate change are an issue, is that the seeing of ourselves as separate from nature, as being above it, and therefore capable of doing what we will with it, is inherently problematic. It's divisionary. It's very often considered a fundamentally Western concept, and it's not entirely true, but it very often is received that way. That this, saying we are above allows us to simply say, I'm going to, destroy that mountain and build something, or kill that thing and have dinner. And it is this separation, supposedly, that has led to some of the things we're discussing tonight. So the question that I'd like us to address is simply, is this useful at all? Is it problematic, as people like Timothy Morton have to some degree spoken about? Or is there a way to not do this? I'm not sure. I suppose it's a very open question. Who would like to jump in?
It's quite useful. Unfortunately, a lot of the uses to which it's put are quite pernicious. So that's the problem. you know, it wouldn't, I don't think there would be this distinction if it weren't useful. We know what a human being is, we know what's not a human being, and we know what's an animal. To realize that humans are animals is an important thing. To fully realize it is an important thing. And, I think ever since Darwin, that has been one of the important trends of modern thought, at least. At the same time, there is clearly a species difference, and it's hard to not notice it. You know, you can talk to your dog, but your dog can't talk back to you. Not really. Not in the same language that you use anyway. You can communicate. Trees communicate with one another. A lot of the privileges that were traditionally attributed to the human as opposed to the animal turn out not to be quite so exclusively the property of human beings. I think it's important to try to go back to my earlier point, to try to escape notions or undercut notions of autonomy and separateness. Is the human, the notion that the human is different from the animal is incontrovertible, but the notion that the human is somehow superior or separable from the animal is quite another thing to ask about. And so one can certainly say no, humans cannot be separated from, the notion of the human cannot be separated from the animal. They're bound together, they're part of the same planet, part of the same life thread. So while there's a usefulness to it, there's also a way in which you really have to push against it.
What do you think, Dustin? Pretty keen on this?
Yeah. So again, this is a biological perspective. It doesn't necessarily bear on any larger moral perspectives here. But I think I can speak for most biologists in saying that within that particular field, this separation between man and nature is almost not recognized at all. I think we actually tend to overemphasize how much agency we do have and have an overblown idea of our position in the entire course of this planet. Again, our species has only existed for about 200,000 years out of 4.6 billion years of existence. For all the statistics that we've cited up here as to how we as a species have modified the planet, even permanently modified the planet, our influence and our collective change to this planet is still inferior to what has occurred billions of years ago. So the influence of various species, various lineages of bacteria in producing the atmosphere on this planet far exceeds the influence that we've had on the planet. The influence of bacteria, vascular plants, so the trees and other plants that we see here, have had a far greater influence on even the geology of this planet than we have. So in the time scale, we're just a minuscule, almost unobservable point. And in the overall effect, even at this point, we're still not of the most major influences on this planet. So we do need to put it in perspective in that regard. In that it's not just us as the arbiters deciding whether we're going to do something to the planet, do something to the rest of the life here, or not. The other thing I want to bring up is that we are much more connected to the rest of the life on this planet than most people appreciate. For example, you might have heard in the popular news, this is becoming a recognized issue, we're losing our ability to fight bacterial infections using antibiotics. So evolution is taking place in our species, but also among these other species. So we don't have the choice of stepping outside. We might consider ourselves separate from nature, but nature doesn't consider itself separate from us, even on a genetic basis. So we've had a major increase in the technologies in the last decade to be able to look at the genome, look at the genes that make up us as a species, but then also look at the genes that make up each of us as an individual. And one of the interesting discoveries from this work is that our genome, our genetic makeup, our software, in part comes from other species. There's viruses, that's kind of an introductory here, the material for those that aren't familiar with specifically what a virus is. A virus is a piece of software, it's a piece of DNA or a related molecule called RNA that actually inserts itself or ends up being inserted into one of our cells, and that software, those instructions are carried out by the cell. In some cases, in viruses referred to as retroviruses, that piece of software, that genetic code, is inserted into the overall genetic code of the cell, the organism. HIV, for example, is a retrovirus. So in the cells that are infected by HIV, their permanent operating system, their software has been changed. In some cases, these viruses infect the germline. Those are the cells in your body that are producing either eggs or sperm. And if it gets incorporated into the genome, the genetic code of those cells, that's actually passed on to subsequent generations. And this transfer of DNA is sloppy. There's other ways that DNA can be transferred among species. Bacteria can transfer DNA among species. There's these DNA elements utilized by bacteria called plasmids that can be transmitted to plants. So this recognition that we're separate, either willfully or just as part of nature, is totally wrong. Viruses are affecting our genetic code. Bacteria are interacting with our metabolism, our physicality, and increasingly this idea that we're separate and it's our choice to make is being eroded on almost a yearly basis as we recognize on the genetic level and the physiological level how intricately tied, and again this is beyond our capacity to choose, necessarily intricately tied to all the other elements of nature. So whether we decide to control it or not, we are participating in this interaction. And to a large degree, we are being controlled by nature. We are not separate from it.
Can I just jump in real quick? So, the human nature thing, my students always want to talk about that when I teach environmental history. But of course, the human nature divide, that was fascinating, by the way, about the extent to which we're part of a larger ecosystem. The concept of a human nature divide is, of course, very brief, even within human history. It's very historically and culturally specific. You could almost time it, really, with the beginning of the industrial age, the assumptions that one could separate humans and nature. More recently, in popular culture, there's been a real fascination with, a concern and alarm about the decreasing efficacy of antibiotics. But also all these kind of stories about the second brain, how actually it's our intestinal life, our gastrointestinal life, that controls us much more than we're aware of. And so if we only eat McDonald's hamburgers, we are perhaps creating a pretty unhealthy ecosystem in there that's affecting our entire personality, not just making us unhealthy, obviously, but affecting our mental processes. And so in that respect, I kind of like the idea of thinking of like gastrocene and processed food, right? But you also see these stories on on the web about the woman who had these weird worms in her eyeball and the guy who had the tapeworm 6 feet long coming out of the nether regions. People are fascinated with these stories because they show the extent, very graphically, they show the extent to which we are, of course, a part of nature. And in nature is inhabiting us in a way that makes us quite uncomfortable. So, again, Anthropocene, maybe not as big a deal as we need to worry about. That makes me feel better.
we're running out of time
We
here,
are.
but can I just say
Yes.
one little thing maybe
Please.
to get us going into Q&A?
Yes.
So, you know, this human nature divide, of course, I'm reaffirming John and Keiko here of the understanding that these binaries are useful to justify appropriation of resources of other people. You know, that it's very important to kind of note that. And as we're talking about viruses and symbiotes and all of the things, you know, that have control over us, thinking in relation and not in division, I think is the understanding that we're coming to. And I loved your question about our disciplines in relationship to this term, and I just want to end by saying how much I think art is so useful in thinking about this, because relation, switching points of view, thinking about scale, thinking about media, these are all ways in which artists are kind of reimagining the conceptual and material terms of the world. So I'm really I'm interested in how art can be viral too. You know, how art can present new concepts of imagining outside of economic value systems, for instance. Even though it seems out there, I think fiction and film and television and visual art really does and needs to do a better job of creating some lattice work that we can hold on to about where to go next.
That's actually great. If we could go a few slides to the final question, which Jimmy just started on, is the next one. Yeah, I guess this one and the next one is what we should do. This is very questionable. So I'd like, before we jump into Q&A, if each of you could respond a bit fairly briefly on this, is, I mean, we are academics, right? That's what we're paid to do. We're paid to study, to write books, to teach students, who we subject to all kinds of things. But this is important, right? This is what we do, we consider important, clearly, but how do our specific disciplines, the ways we approach things, the ways we think about knowing, about knowledge, in a sense, interact with the ideas we've been talking about today. I really like this idea of how art can provide a lattice work. I like that. It's a great image of kind of having something to grasp to over sort of floundering in the difficulties of what this all means. But interesting. Okay, so who'd like to jump in?
Well, how does my research, I'm not really researching the Anthropocene. I really study early modern and modern forest conflicts. But to the extent that I work on the within the concept of the Anthropocene, I look at conflicting systems of value and conflicting ideas about exploitation and the ways that people come to accommodation and the ways they come into extremely violent conflict. And for my students, I work very hard to avoid a wholly declensionist approach to understanding humans' interaction with the environment. But it's hard, right? Because there's so much loss. But in the fact that I myself study struggle and conflict and politics, environmental politics, over the long term, I try to use that to empower my students and show that different systems of value can win. There's not just one inevitable outcome.
Yeah, I'd like to answer this question as an educator rather than a biologist. One of the things that I've emphasized recently in my courses is being active in regard to partitioning information and misinformation. That's a pretty clear-cut objective in the sciences, as certain things are recognized within biology as being a fact. There are certain things that are true and things that are not true, and sometimes that's not accurately conveyed in the popular media or even in some venues that appear to be scientific but actually aren't. So the things I tell my students that are actually very simple is whenever you get a piece of information, particularly if it's something that has some ultimate bearing on your life, make sure you know where this is coming from. In a lot of cases now, you're getting media online, It's not attributed to anybody. That's unreliable information. If you can identify who it's coming from, who is that person? And this applies, I would say, equally for the arts. Sometimes we see a piece, sometimes that piece is modified from the original, sometimes that piece is incorporated into something totally different than the venue in which it was produced. You know, where is that coming from? In a lot of cases, again, you don't have that information. Under those circumstances, that's not good information. You shouldn't be acting upon that information. If it is a piece of factual information, can be confirmed as true or false. Are references provided? Is this information being provided by the person that did the research? In a lot of cases, it's not. If it's coming from the person that did the research, are they explaining how they reached this conclusion? Are they providing the evidence? Are they providing the methods that they use to get this information? In many cases, all that is missing from the information that you get, primarily from the internet, but also increasingly print sources. And it really is a responsibility of each individual to dismiss that information or follow it back to the ultimate source, but not simply to accept it, because that puts a whole nother many layers of impediment in us coming from different perspectives and reaching potentially a general conclusion if we're not actually communicating with each other and we're not actually acquiring real information.
So the way the Anthropocene is relevant to me in my field, well, partly because I work on science fiction and it is a scientific concept, and so there's a relevance there in the sense that it's really important to a lot of people who are thinking about the future. But I would say, to put it in a nutshell, the Anthropocene is a story that we're telling ourselves right now about who we are. And that's what I'm interested in, and that's what my field and my research are all about.
Well, thank you very much for all the excellent responses. We've got about maybe 5 to 10 minutes to open up to the room. Does anyone have any questions you'd like to ask of the panel?
What is your department again? Sorry.
English.
No, moderate.
For me? Oh, English as well.
It was good.
Yeah, I do medieval British literature.
Right. As Keiko was saying earlier about she doesn't have the answer, and really nobody has. But and I would have liked to have some input from maybe like somebody from the political science department. Not a thing on your moderation. It was like a really great panel, very impressive, oiled. Very good looking too. But what was my question again? No. So if there is an answer to be found, and I'm guessing there is an answer because I also heard there was maybe, let it be, maybe there's no need of an answer, but if there is an answer, maybe it's political.
Right. I mean, I didn't really, we didn't really get to all of that, but I think politics is very important here. And when we were talking about economics and the economics of sustainability and value and all of that, I mean, I think politics is going to be key to trying to hash out what the true cost of capitalism is, what the true cost of transportation is, what the true cost of human labor is, what if we're, as we have already determined, value is arbitrary and abstract, but we have to think about, or maybe I should say, the true value in terms of not just economic value, but also human value and the value of life and the value of earth, etc. And that can be political. That can happen in the political and legal system. So I think politics is really important. I do, and I would love to have a political scientist here kind of talk about that and all of the specific strategies that need to happen in different on different levels as well. Local systems, national systems, international systems, or if those international systems are really working for us or not. You know, what are the sustainability goals really doing for us? I'm not sure. But as a humanities scholar, I also just want to emphasize that I think ethics is really important. You know, beyond a political system, we need an ethics, we need an imaginary that gives us a kind of day-to-day politics, or again, a lattice work, or another kind of politics. So I am also deeply interested in the way that we need to kind of reimagine our relationships with the world through the kind of metaphors that we use. Through, you know, we use the same metaphor, we use the same economic metaphors over and over again because it's easy to think that way. And so if we use different metaphors, can we change politics? That's kind of where I come from. So, but I do agree with you. I think politics is very important.
I mean, I think that's why I resist so much this monetization of the Bob Costanza's ecosystem services, which is he's an economist. But in thinking about, in response to your remarks, Jamie, about scales, I mean, of course, the political is really the only way we can engage in our human lifetimes to respond to the Anthropocene. And that's why I think it's kind of cute, really, that the geological scientists are so fixated on finding the year when the golden spike began. And look, they found the Sitka spruce in the Southern Ocean, and now they can designate the Anthropocene. But for those of the rest of us who have to go on living and really don't operate on the scales of geological eras much and epochs, what is the scale of our response? And people do respond on all kinds of levels. We respond by, you know, making that choice between, oh my God, I just used a plastic cup or a paper cup, which will go on long after I live, to challenging contemporary politics, to, you know, resisting buying things, to our own pedagogy. So I think we are responding, I would hope, politically. But that part of the conversation didn't go as far as I had hoped either. But it's there.
I want to say, you know, if the Anthropocene is a story that we're telling ourselves about who we are, it's very important that there are a lot of people who are trying to tell a different story and completely ignore this story. Climate change deniers, the purveyors of fake news, or accusations of fake news towards real news. So that's, for me, the most direct political interface. It has very much to do with, you know, sorting out information from misinformation, right? But also, you know, the kind of stories that we choose to tell have an awful lot to do with the directions that we choose to take, and that we bring into the conversation as vehicle for taking. So yeah, I mean, you know, you can't, monetization has, I think it's a mistake to equate money with capitalism. Money's not going to disappear just because you get rid of capitalism. Values, certainly, or some kind of universal system of valuation isn't going to disappear if you get rid of capitalism. You have to have some kind of scales of value or means of measuring value. What's supposed to disappear when you get rid of capitalism is private property and exploitation of labor for appropriation by the capitalists. So that's a rather different thing than money. Right? So I think, you know, the conversation has to find some kind of basic term when we're talking about, you know, it's such a complex set of different things as the environment and its impact on people's lives.
Yes.
I teach a class on sustainability, and one of my biggest challenges I've found over the years is that getting students, and I say this to them many times throughout the semester, is that I'm giving you all this information, right? But I can tell now that, like, even though I give it to you, and we're here in an academic setting, you don't feel it. You know, you don't feel the decisions you make every day. You know, their impact tomorrow, 5 years from now, 30 years from now, right? And how do we, you know, and that's a serious question. I tell them I'm not sure there's a solid answer. I don't have all the answers, but that's one of the things that I try to stress to them. How do we learn how to feel like in that way, you know? That's kind of the one thing I don't know if I've really heard much about. So.
Well, I think that I had that same conversation today, or this morning in one of my classes, and I think that also just comes from being in this particular place and time in the U.S. teaching at UH, where students might not feel the impact here in this particular space, but other people on the island are feeling that impact. And other people around the world are also feeling that impact. So it might not be that no one's feeling it, it might just be that some of us are not feeling it because we live a pretty privileged life. So I think part of what I'm interested in terms of art is how do you create empathy with and connection and relation with the experiences and the stories of how climate change and the Anthropocene is actually affecting parts of the world that we're not in already right now, and I think because we're here, you know, one of the things that we do, one of our great biological traits is empathy, and we can feel another's experiences through representation and through communication. So I think that's an important part for me.
I made this point earlier. I think it's worth coming back to. The scale has compressed so rapidly that our decisions now and our collective decisions, you know, involving politics and getting like masses of people to act as a whole, the next generation is going to see this happen, and it's going to happen here as well. There's forecasts from our own University of Hawaii here, our own scientists, showing that large portions of Waikiki will be underwater within the next 100 years. So 50 years from now, Kalakaua Avenue might be underwater. So when we look to politics and we look to society and see the things that people do get angry about and are interested in fighting for, voting in regard to Social Security, for example, this is something that, you know, affects us late in life, decades away maybe, but affects the next generation as well. So we can see that people can get fired up about these things and recognize decisions on that time scale of now just decades, no longer hundreds or thousands of years. So maybe a generation ago this wasn't apparent, but accurately conveying the situation brings it into the scale that we do deal with and do get active and angry about on a regular basis.
Yeah, and with the students, all they have to do is, maybe they're not looking around. I mean, really, all you have to do is look at the intensification of the weather, even within the short time that they've been undergraduates. You know, I mean, of course there's weather and there's climate, and we know there's a difference, but, you know, as Justin's saying, we're talking about 2 to 3 feet in a matter of 50 years. And all you have to do is look at the king tides. All you have to do is go down to the Halekulani and look at the beach erosion that there's been in the past 10 years. It's shocking. And then maybe they'll feel it.
I think if I could jump in very quickly, one thing that I think is really instructive here is the problem of shifting baseline syndrome.
Right.
And so when I was growing up and you know, going snorkeling around, you know, I would see all kinds of fish. If I go now, they're gone, right? But if I take my son, who's only 2.5, and I teach him how to snorkel and he sees stuff, that will be his normal. That will be what he expects, right? That this lack of fish, this lack of life, to me, will be his reality. And so I think one thing that, speaking as the English after the table, I think that story here is really important, that the role of art, the role of story as we tell it. I mean, there is, even in simple things like documentaries, there's a great documentary called Chasing Coral that came out recently that does an amazing job showing the same coral reef alive and then completely bleached out something like 3 months later. And it shows this over and over again. And so I think you're, Justin's right, this collapsing the scale for ourselves and our students is to some degree can be very compelling if we give them the right, I suppose, story and sort of say, look, like this is literally happening within the span of the last time you went and had coffee. And you know, it is right there, it is tangible. And again, I always go back to my own experience that I go out to the ocean and it looks different than when I was young. And I find that extraordinary. To see that change in my own lifetime is just something else, really. I think we have time for one more question. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd like John to speak to, and Jamie to some extent too, to this question of of how rooted we are in certain values and the necessity to actually be able to look outside of that, John, through something like science fiction, how that might help people move out of the particular way they think of things, because it seems people are so embedded that they don't have any vision of any other possibility than just what we're living in. So can you speak to that?
Well, it's certainly one of the things that's often said, and I think it truly said about science fiction, is that it gives people, one of the most important things that it gives people is a story that tells you the world could be different from what it is. That it fights against the sense that the real is the inevitable. So that, you know, the way things are is the way that they have to be. And that's a story that's always been told by a certain kind of people in power in order to maintain their power. You can't, you know, Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative, right? But there is. And science fiction is a genre. I don't think it's unique in this capability. I think a lot of other kinds of literature do it as well, but it is a genre that's particularly invested in inventing different worlds, inventing alternative realities. Sometimes they're nightmarish, but sometimes they're better. But even when they're nightmarish, they're meant usually, I think, to alert you to ways in which the world you're living in could be better by fighting against these nightmarish tendencies within your own world, because they never come from nowhere. So that this utopian impulse is, you can even see a utopian impulse in television commercials, in my opinion, shampoo commercial. Your body could be like that. If only you use that shampoo. It invents this imaginary world that's better. Its mode of suggesting you can reach that world is by buying a product, which is totally a lie. But nonetheless, there's this utopian impulse that can be separated from it. So I think that utopian impulse runs through all kinds of stories, but it's particularly in science fiction that it's fleshed out often in the most kind of concrete and detailed ways.
I'll just follow that up really quickly with that. I really truly agree with everything that you said, and I think as I suggested earlier, I think metaphor is very important, and thinking about different kinds of metaphors is very important. But in terms of visual art, I want to offer something else, which is a lot of contemporary artists are working with all kinds of materials, and I'm writing a book on the ocean and how artists are engaging in the ocean, how artists are engaging in the environment, and maybe even using trash or other things. And going back to Will's question of how do you get the students engaged, part of what art can do is present a problem or a project where people have to learn materials in a different way. They have a different kind of material engagement with the world. And when they do that, sometimes they understand what they don't know about it, or they discover the complexity of a problem. Especially, there's a lot of students working with plastic trash from the ocean, for instance. And when they start collecting that plastic to work with it and realize the extent or the scale of how much plastic is actually drifting up on the beach, and they're embodied in that problem, I think it feels a little bit, it hits home in a different way. So that's maybe another way art can kind of get out of those frameworks.
I'm really sorry I have to cut this off, but we are getting quite late, and I think we're all looking forward to a nice warm bed at some point. So I want to thank you all for coming. I'd like us to give a round of applause to our wonderful panel. Just very briefly before we run away, we do have 2 more of these events if you're interested. If you can do some more slides, it'd be great. If not, that's fine. On March the 8th, it's a Thursday. Our next one is Borders and Boundaries. It's going to discuss borders and boundaries between everything, between people, between cultures, between languages, etc. We have a series of amazing panelists for that. And our final event will be on, let me just go all the way to the one, and it's on the website. Our final event will be on post-humanism and transhumanism. This is on March 16th. Same time, but both these second and third event will be in the East West Center Burns Hall, which is just down the road that way towards where you turned into UH. And we have a series of really interesting people, including, many of you have heard recently, we found the first interstellar object ever sort of recorded. Dr. Karen Meach will be one of our panelists for that final event, and she will bring an interesting perspective on issues of artificial intelligence and what it means, for example, to, what would it mean if we actually pitched a tent on Mars and did these things? What would it mean to be human? If a baby was born on Mars, what would that mean? What would it actually do to them biologically, for example, right? It has a lower gravity. What would happen to them biologically as they grew? But also ethically and morally and all the rest of it. What does it mean to be human if you aren't born on Earth?